on November 30, the Berkut police initiated crackdown on the peaceful student sit-in, and violence against unarmed protesters backfired on the authorities. And instead of subduing the resistance, it actually led to greater mobilization of citizens in December. Ola, given your ongoing research on civic mobilization in Ukraine, could you tell us more about how large and diverse were the protests and the protest movement became that emerged in December?
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, first I would just like to note that several models of mass protests do note that repression tends to have an opposite effect, specifically when repression is viewed as illegitimate. And in our rapid interviews, it was very clear that the protesters that turned out to join in the Maidan and all over Kiev, but also all over Ukraine, they joined because they saw these actions by the Berkut militia as illegitimate. So that's really important. And that mobilized this broader cross-class, cross-cleavage coalition of Ukrainian citizens. What we do know is that shortly within a day on the Sunday that followed, the protests were upwards of 800,000. So while during the week prior, they were about 30,000, maybe a max of 35, 40,000 in the center of Kiev, by that Sunday, after the repressions, we had about 800,000 people in the streets. Other estimates have higher numbers as well. But what was most interesting is that there was a diffusion of protests throughout the country, and not only in the west and center, but also throughout some pockets of the east and south. So this was truly an exceptional mobilization for Ukraine. One thing that I would like to note is that we've been rather surprised conducting surveys as part of the Ukrainian protest project, conducting surveys of protest participants. We were very surprised that the average age of protesters was 36, and that there was about 1 in 7 were over the age of 30, and then about 1 in 2 were older than 55. So there was a significant portion of this median voter aspect to the mobilization. So it wasn't only activists and students after the repressions. They were predominantly well-educated and predominantly employed, but that was, of course, the majority, not all of the protesters. And they did have a diverse, perhaps, maybe linguistic representation. And I found that most fascinating in that while 82% of the protest respondents chose Ukrainian mother tongue in the surveys, about 65 to 68% of them use Ukrainian at work and at home. This means there were over a quarter of the protesters that actively used Russian at work and in their private lives. So by all accounts in political science, we would count them as Russian speakers. So it wasn't this Ukrainian language-dominated group. And the protests were very much diverse over time. There was slightly more men taking part in protest events, about 59%, but this was different at different points of the day, and specifically at night there tended to be more male participants. But also this group was very diverse in terms of their political preferences. While a majority did not vote for Yanukovych in the 2010 presidential elections, about 1 in 5 protesters did not vote for Tymoshenko. And about 1 in 10, so about 10%, did not vote for Yushchenko in 2004. So these were people that have previously supported perhaps Yanukovych, Tihipko, and other candidates, not necessarily what we would perceive to be the opposition. This diversity lasted until January, and you wanted me to touch on what changed in January. And the most notable difference after the January violence broke out and the turn to violent repertoires was that there were fewer women participating specifically in the hot zones of the mobilization, and specifically at night.
Yeah. Go ahead if you wanted to add something.
No, in terms of what we can tell, we stopped our surveys in January, but we continued some rapid interviews throughout January, and we don't see that on these other parameters, in terms of language use, in terms of religiosity, in terms of political preferences, these seem to be more or less the same kind of people participating. The majority actually from central Ukraine, not from western Ukraine. But the difference is that after January, there are more men represented amongst the protesters.